The words hit Susanna Bristol like a fist to the sternum. She had been standing at the edge of Coldwater Creek, her boots sinking slightly into the soft mud at the bank, her fingers still wrapped around the handle of the water bucket she had carried down from the house. The morning sun had barely cleared the ridgeline, and the light was that pale, trembling gold that comes before the heat of the day crushes everything flat. She had not expected him to be there. She had not expected anyone to be there. And she certainly had not expected what came out of his mouth when she turned around and found Lionel Lockhart standing 10 feet away, his hat in his hands, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression that looked like a man confessing to something he had been carrying for a very long time. He said it simply. No preamble, no soft approach, just the truth, laid bare between them like something precious and terrifying dropped onto the ground. "I have stopped at 100 towns," he said, his voice low and rough as gravel, "and only one made me want to stay." Susanna felt the bucket slip in her grip. She caught it barely, and the water inside sloshed over the rim and soaked through her boot leather. She did not move. She could not move, because the weight of what he had just said was pressing down on her chest with a force that had nothing to do with the morning air and everything to do with the fact that 2 weeks ago she had overheard something she was never meant to hear, something that should have made her distrust Lionel Lockhart entirely. Something that had told her his presence in the town of Redgrass, New Mexico, was not accidental, was not innocent, and was certainly not what he had claimed it to be. And yet here he stood at her creek, at her private morning hour, telling her she was the reason he had not ridden on. The betrayal she had felt 2 weeks ago and the feeling blooming in her chest right now were fighting each other with the savagery of 2 dogs over a single bone, and Susanna did not know which one she wanted to win. She stared at him. He stared back, and the creek ran on beside them, indifferent and cold and clear as the truth she was not yet sure she was ready to hear. To understand how they arrived at this particular morning, standing in the mud by Coldwater Creek, with Lionel Lockhart's confession hanging in the air between them, you have to go back 5 weeks. You have to go back to the evening the stranger rode into Redgrass with a bullet hole in his coat, and a story full of holes that nobody in town thought to question, except Susanna Bristol, who had been questioning everything since the moment her husband, Thomas Bristol, died in what the county sheriff called a mining accident, and what Susanna called something else entirely. Redgrass was not a large town. It sat in a shallow valley in the territory of New Mexico in the year 1883, hemmed in on 2 sides by pale red bluffs, and serviced by a single rail spur that came through twice a week carrying mail, supplies, and occasionally passengers who had gotten on the wrong train and ended up somewhere they had not intended. The town had a main street with a mercantile, a livery, a land office, a saloon called the Blue Sage, and a doctor's practice that doubled as the barber shop when Dr. Fenwick needed extra income, which was most of the time. There was a church at the north end and a small schoolhouse behind it. There were perhaps 230 souls in Redgrass proper, with another several dozen spread out across the surrounding ranches and homesteads. Susanna Bristol owned one of those homesteads. It sat 2 miles east of town on 40 acres of dry but workable land where she kept a small herd of cattle, a vegetable garden that she tended with iron discipline, and a house that her husband had built with his own hands before his death 18 months earlier. She was 27 years old. She had chestnut hair the color of dark honey that she wore pinned up during the day and loose at night. She had gray eyes that people in Redgrass had learned to treat carefully, because they did not miss much and they did not forgive easily. She was not the kind of woman men in 1883 expected to be running a homestead alone, and she had long since stopped caring what men in 1883 expected. She had a hired hand named Clem Hooper, who was 53 and had known Thomas Bristol since before the war, and who helped her with the cattle and the fence lines, and did not ask too many questions about why she sometimes sat up late reading through the papers Thomas had left behind. She had a neighbor 2 miles to the north named Margaret Alcott, a widow in her early 40s who brought food when the seasons turned, and who was the only person in Redgrass whom Susanna fully trusted. And she had a situation that nobody else in town understood, which was the quiet, persistent belief that her husband had not died by accident, that someone had caused it, and that the person who had caused it had never answered for what they had done. Thomas had died in a silver mine 6 miles outside of town. The mine was called the Cassidy Claim, named for the man who had first staked it. By the time Thomas died, the Cassidy Claim was co-owned by 3 men: Thomas Bristol, a speculator from Santa Fe named Harlan Reeves, and the county land agent, a man named Dolph Crane who had an office on Main Street and a reputation for knowing exactly where the money was in any given situation. The official report said that a tunnel had collapsed. The report said Thomas had been inside when it happened. The report said it was a structural failure brought on by improper shoring, and it was signed by Sheriff Calvin Pratt, who had been doing Dolph Crane's administrative errands for as long as anyone could remember. Susanna had read the report 4 times. She had then walked into the mine with a lantern and Clem Hooper 2 days after they buried her husband, and she had looked at the so-called collapse with her own eyes. The shoring had not failed. The timbers had been cut. Someone with a saw and a purpose had visited that tunnel before Thomas did, and the tunnel had come down on him with the kind of precision that accidents do not typically manage. She had taken this information to Sheriff Pratt. He had told her that grief did strange things to a person's mind. She had taken it to the county seat. The county seat had referred her back to Sheriff Pratt. She had written to the territorial capital in Santa Fe and received a letter 3 weeks later expressing condolences. Dolph Crane had continued to walk down Main Street every morning in his clean boots and his pressed vest and nod at people pleasantly. And Harlan Reeves had acquired Thomas's share of the mine for considerably less than it was worth by presenting Susanna with a document she later realized she should have read more carefully before signing it in the raw shock of widowhood. So Susanna had spent 18 months building a quiet, patient case from the pieces she could gather on her own, and she had been doing this alone, and the loneliness of it was the kind that settles into a person's bones and makes them walk differently, makes them hold their face in a particular way, makes them very careful about who they trust and how much of themselves they show. Then, on a Tuesday evening in late September of 1883, Lionel Lockhart rode into Redgrass. He came in from the south, which meant he had come up from the dry country below the Sangre de Cristo foothills, which was not a direction people typically came from unless they knew the back trails or had a reason to avoid the main road. He was riding a dark bay horse that was trail-lean but sound, carrying a bedroll and saddlebags and a rifle in the scabbard, and wearing clothes that were clean but not new, the clothes of someone who had been on the road long enough to have stopped noticing what day it was. He was 31 years old. He was tall with the kind of lean, hard build that comes from years of physical work and not enough food, and he had dark eyes under heavy brows and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red stone as the bluffs outside of town. He had a scar that ran along his left jaw from the ear to the chin, which was not something he explained voluntarily. He rode straight and quiet, and he came into the livery at Amos Price's stable and paid for his horse's board in coin, which immediately raised him a full tier in Amos Price's estimation, because many men who came through Redgrass tried to pay in promises. He took a room at the boarding house run by a woman named Clara Deeds, which was the only boarding house in town, and sat above the hardware store on the south end of Main Street. He ate supper at the Blue Sage Saloon, which also served food most evenings. He had 2 glasses of whiskey and spoke to no one except to order and to say thank you, which was noted by the bartender, a sharp-eyed man named Pete Ockhaffer, who had a habit of cataloging newcomers, because experience had taught him that strangers either brought trouble or money, and it was worth knowing which kind you were dealing with before they had the chance to tell you themselves. Susanna did not see Lionel Lockhart that first evening. She was at her homestead, working through the last of the autumn fence repairs before the cold came in hard. She heard about the stranger from Margaret Alcott the following morning when Margaret came by with a pot of venison stew and the news of the previous evening, as Margaret tended to do, because Margaret was not a gossip so much as a woman who understood that information was a form of protection, and she believed Susanna deserved every protection available to her. "A drifter came in last night," Margaret said, setting the pot on the stove and wiping her hands on her apron. "Came up from the south. Amos says his horse has been ridden hard but treated well. He's staying at Clara's." "Many drifters come through," Susanna said, not looking up from the map she was annotating on the kitchen table, a careful drawing of the mine and the surrounding land claim boundaries. "This one has a bullet hole in his coat," Margaret said. "Amos noticed when he was hanging it up. Recent hole, not mended." Susanna looked up then. "Did he say where he came from?" "Not to anyone who thought to ask in the right way," Margaret said. "But Clara mentioned he asked specifically about the land office when he paid his room board, asked if Dolph Crane still ran it." The name Dolph Crane moved through Susanna's chest like a cold wind through a cracked window. She set down her pen. She looked at Margaret. "He asked for Dolph by name," she said. "By name," Margaret confirmed. Susanna did not believe in coincidences. She had stopped believing in coincidences around the same time she stopped believing that her husband had died in a simple accident. She picked up her pen again, very deliberately, and added a small notation to the map. "Thank you, Margaret," she said. "For the stew and the rest of it." Margaret nodded, understanding in her quiet way that she had just handed Susanna something significant, and not entirely sure she felt good about it. The following morning, Susanna went into town. She did her weekly errands at the mercantile, picked up her mail from the postal window in the back of the general store, and then took a careful walk down Main Street at a pace designed to let her observe things without appearing to be observing them, which was a skill she had developed over the course of 18 months of being underestimated. She saw Lionel Lockhart come out of the land office at 10 minutes past 10 in the morning. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment, squinting against the morning sun, and she took note of him the way you take note of something that does not fit the established picture. He did not look satisfied. He did not look like a man who had just concluded a successful piece of business. He looked like a man who had received information he had not entirely expected, and who was now working out what to do with it. Their eyes met. It was brief, no more than 2 or 3 seconds, but it was the kind of look that registers something, the kind that both parties walk away from knowing that the other person is not quite what they appear to be, that there is something underneath the surface worth paying attention to. Susanna looked away first. She walked to the postal window and collected her mail. When she came back out onto the boardwalk, Lionel Lockhart was gone. She thought about him for the rest of the day and was mildly irritated with herself for doing so. He appeared at the mercantile the following afternoon when Susanna was there buying lamp oil and flour. She was aware of him the moment he walked through the door in the way you are aware of something that has already caught your attention and now refuses to be ignored. He bought rope, coffee beans, and a tin of saddle soap. He did not look at her until he was paying, and then he looked at her directly and said, "Afternoon," in a voice that was lower than she had expected and entirely level, and she said, "Afternoon," back, and that was all. But the following day he was at the Blue Sage at noon when she came in to speak to Pete Ockhaffer about a message. She had asked him to pass along to a contact at the county seat, and he was at the post office the day after that. And the day after that she found him at the north end of Main Street, examining one of the posted notices about grazing land availability, with the concentrated attention of someone who was not actually reading the notice at all. By the end of the first week, she had made a decision. She was going to find out who Lionel Lockhart was and what he wanted with Dolph Crane, because in a town as small as Redgrass, a stranger with a bullet hole in his coat and a specific interest in the land agent was either a problem for her or a resource for her, and she needed to know which. She arranged it the way she arranged most things, practically, without ceremony. She was walking back from the creek one evening, bucket in hand, when she came around the corner of the church and nearly collided with him. He stepped back, she kept her footing. There was a single long moment where they were closer than propriety in 1883 would have suggested was comfortable, and then he stepped back further and touched the brim of his hat and said, "Pardon me, ma'am," and she said, "You have been in Redgrass 9 days and you have visited the land office 3 times. What is your business with Dolph Crane?" The directness of it landed on him visibly. He went still. Not tense exactly, but contained, the way a man goes still when he is recalculating something quickly and quietly. "What makes you think I have business with Crane specifically?" he said. "You asked about him by name when you arrived," Susanna said. "You spent 40 minutes in his office on Wednesday and 35 on Friday. You are not here to buy land or file a claim. You have no paperwork, no surveying equipment, and no associates. Whatever you are doing in that office has nothing to do with the legitimate business of a land agent." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, something in his face shifted. Not a smile, not quite, but an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of someone who has been seen clearly and is deciding what to do about it. "You have been watching me," he said. "I watch everyone," Susanna said, "but you more carefully than most. My name is Susanna Bristol. My husband died in the Cassidy mine 18 months ago. Dolph Crane co-owned that mine. Now who are you and what do you want with him?" She watched him absorb this. She watched his expression change from careful assessment to something more complex, something that contained surprise and a specific kind of recognition, and then settle into a gravity that told her, with a certainty she had learned to trust in herself, that whatever his dark past was, and whatever hidden motive had brought him to Redgrass, it was not separate from what had brought her to this particular corner of suspicion and loss. It overlapped with it, maybe significantly. "My name is Lionel Lockhart," he said, "and I think we may be looking for the same thing." They did not talk that night at the church corner. Not fully, not the way the moment seemed to call for. Susanna was not in the habit of handing her trust to strangers on the strength of a few interesting sentences, and she could see that Lionel Lockhart, for all his apparent willingness to acknowledge the overlap in their interests, was also not the kind of man who lay his cards on the table for just anyone. They agreed, with a kind of mutual, unspoken caution, to meet the following evening at the far end of the creek road, away from town, away from any windows that might contain watching eyes. She lay awake that night in her quiet house and tried to organize what she felt about the situation into something manageable and logical. She thought about the hidden motive she had attributed to him. She thought about the bullet hole. She thought about the fact that he had asked for Dolph Crane by name, and she thought about all the things that suggested. And she told herself firmly that she was going to that meeting to gather information, and not because of the way his eyes had looked at her outside the church, which was like someone who had been walking in the dark for a long time and had just seen a lamp in a distant window. She told herself that firmly and twice, and then she turned over and went to sleep, and she dreamed about a creek in winter, ice on the edges and cold, dark water running in the middle, and someone standing on the opposite bank who she could not quite see clearly. He was already at the creek road when she arrived. He had not lit a fire, which she appreciated, because a fire would have been visible and she was not ready for this conversation to be visible. He was standing beside his horse, stroking the animal's neck in an absent, habitual way that suggested the horse was his oldest companion, and he did not entirely know what to do with his hands in situations that required a different kind of steadiness. She stopped 5 feet from him and looked at him in the fading evening light. "Tell me why you are here," she said. He told her. His name was Lionel Lockhart, and he had grown up in Kansas, in a small town called Abilene, in the years after the cattle drives had turned it into a place of considerable money and considerable violence and considerable opportunity, for men who understood how to move in the spaces between legitimate commerce and outright criminality. His father had been a deputy marshal who had died of a fever when Lionel was 12. His mother had taken in laundry and then taken in boarders and then died of exhaustion and pneumonia when he was 17. He had been on the road since then, working where he could find work, moving on when the work ran out or the situation turned sour. He had been a trail hand, a farm hand, a freighter's assistant, a line rider on the Texas Panhandle, and for 2 years in his middle 20s, a United States deputy marshal working out of Judge Isaac Parker's court in Fort Smith, Arkansas. It was the work as a deputy marshal that had brought him here. Not officially. He had left that work 3 years ago under circumstances he described briefly and without ornament. There had been a case, a land fraud scheme operating across 3 territories, and when he had gotten close enough to it to see the shape of it clearly, he had found that the shape included people who had influence over the people who supervised him, and the case had been closed from above, and he had been encouraged very firmly to let it go, and he had declined to let it go, and the declining had cost him the position and eventually cost him a bullet, which was the origin of the healed scar along his jaw. Courtesy of a man in Colorado who had been hired to deliver a message, and had delivered it imperfectly. Since then he had been following the fraud on his own, piece by piece, in the way that a man follows a thing when he has nothing else left to him that feels like purpose. He had traced it through Colorado, through Arizona, through New Mexico. He had names. He had dates. He had correspondence that he had obtained by methods he did not entirely detail, but that she understood had not been straightforward. And one of the names in the correspondence was Dolph Crane. Dolph Crane was not just a land agent. Dolph Crane was a component in a machine that had been filing fraudulent land claims across 3 territories for the better part of a decade, redirecting mineral rights, suppressing legitimate claims, and occasionally, when suppression was not sufficient, ensuring that the people who held those claims encountered unfortunate circumstances. The kind of circumstances that could be made to look like mining accidents. Susanna stood very still as he finished speaking. The creek ran behind them, and somewhere in the cottonwood trees an owl called twice and went quiet. She became aware that she had been holding her breath for perhaps the last several minutes, and she let it out carefully and looked at Lionel Lockhart and said, "How long have you known about Thomas?" "I did not know his name until tonight," he said, "but I knew Crane had used this method at least twice before in other places. I suspected he had used it here." "The mine was worth significantly more than Reeves paid me for the share," Susanna said. "I know," he said. "I have a copy of an assay report from 1882, the one Crane suppressed before your husband died. The mine was producing at 3 times the rate that was publicly reported." The world shifted slightly under Susanna's feet, the way it shifts when something you suspected but could not prove becomes suddenly, terribly confirmed. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach and breathed. "You have the assay report," she said. "I do," he said, "and several other documents, but documents alone are not enough. The territorial court is not independent of the people I am working against. I need a witness. Someone who can testify to the specific events in Redgrass, the timeline of the mine, the sale of the shares, the pressure that was applied. Someone who knew Thomas Bristol and can speak to what actually happened here." She understood what he was asking. She understood it completely, including the danger in it and the vulnerability it required, and the implicit request for a level of trust that she had not extended to anyone in a very long time. "Why should I trust you?" she said. "You should not," he said, without any hesitation. "Not yet. I am a stranger with a hidden past and no official standing and a history of making decisions that have made powerful people want to do me harm. You would be correct to be careful." "And yet you want my testimony," she said. "I want your help," he said. "That is different, and I want to help you. That is also different. I am not asking you to trust me because I am trustworthy. I am asking you to decide whether we are more useful to each other together than we are apart." She looked at him for a long time in the darkening evening, and she could not decide whether the thing she felt was hope, which was a feeling she had been rationing very carefully for 18 months, or simply the recognition of another person who was living inside the same particular kind of loneliness she was. She said, "Tell me what you need and I will tell you what I can give. We will go from there." He nodded. And that was the beginning of it. Over the next 2 weeks they met 4 more times, always away from town, always in the evening, always with the careful spacing of two people who had each learned that trust built quickly tends to collapse quickly. She gave him the timeline of Thomas's death, the details of the mine, the document she had signed under pressure. He gave her copies of the correspondence he had collected, and she read it in her kitchen by lamplight with Clem Hooper keeping watch at the window, because she was not a fool, and she understood that something had shifted in the situation, and that new vulnerability had been introduced. During those meetings, something else happened, the something else that Susanna had been working hard to keep in its proper category and not allow to expand beyond its bounds. She was beginning to know him. Not the outline of him, not the strategic summary he had offered at the Creek Road that first evening, but the actual texture of him, the way he thought, the way he spoke when he was thinking carefully, the way he looked at a problem from 3 different sides before he committed to a position, the way he was quiet when he was moved by something and loud when he thought he was being dismissed. She was beginning to know that he had a sense of humor that appeared very infrequently and without warning, and was funnier for that. She was beginning to know that he was lonely in the same way she was lonely, not from absence of company, but from the specific loneliness of someone who has been carrying a serious thing alone for too long and has forgotten what it felt like to set it down. She was beginning to understand why he had not ridden on from Redgrass when his business there could have been conducted more efficiently elsewhere, and she was beginning to have feelings about that which she refused to name. And then, on the evening of the 14th day, she made a mistake. She had gone into town in the late afternoon to pick up a wire at the telegraph office, a wire from the contact at the county seat she had been cultivating, a man named Hargrove who had access to the county records, and who owed her a quiet favor from a situation she had helped him navigate 2 years earlier. She got the wire and was walking back through the alley behind the saloon when she heard voices from the doorway of the back room, the storage room where Pete Ockhaffer kept his extra barrels. She heard Dolph Crane's voice first, low and specific, and carrying the particular flatness of a man who is accustomed to giving instructions and having them followed. She heard another voice, a voice she recognized with a physical jolt that stopped her breathing entirely. Lionel Lockhart's voice. She stood in the alley with her back against the rough board wall of the saloon and she listened, and what she heard was Lionel Lockhart telling Dolph Crane that he had identified the Bristol widow as a potential problem, and that he needed more time to assess how much she actually knew and how much of it was actionable. Her hands went cold. Her mind went very still and very cold and very fast simultaneously, the way it does when something you were not prepared for lands on you with full force. She did not hear the rest of the conversation. She walked away from the alley on feet that felt like they belonged to someone else, and she rode home, and she sat in her kitchen with her hands flat on the table, and she told herself that she was not surprised, that she had always known better than to trust a stranger, that the feeling in her chest right now was not heartbreak, because you could not have heartbreak about someone you had only known for 2 weeks, that she was a practical woman and practical women did not make this kind of error. She told herself all of that, and none of it helped very much. She spent 3 days deciding what to do. She did not meet with Lionel Lockhart during those 3 days. She sent a brief note to the meeting location saying she was unwell, which was not exactly untrue. She reread all the documents he had shared with her and tried to see them now through the lens of a trap rather than an alliance. She tried to find the hidden motive in every piece of paper, every detail he had offered her, and she could not find it, not because she was not looking, but because the documents were real. She had checked 2 of the references independently through Hargrove's wire, and they verified. The assay report was genuine. The correspondence naming Crane was genuine. Whatever she had heard in that alley, the documents were real, and real documents pointed towards something that was not a fabricated alliance designed to neutralize her. She was still sitting with this contradiction, still trying to force it into a shape that made sense, when he appeared at the creek on the 5th morning. She had come down to fill the bucket and found him standing there with his hat in his hands, and he had looked at her like a man who had been waiting for the moment to say something difficult and had finally decided that there was no better time than this one. He said, "I have stopped at 100 towns, and only one made me want to stay." She stood in the mud with the bucket dripping, and she looked at him, and the betrayal she felt from the alley and the feeling his words were producing in her were tearing at each other with everything they had, and she could not speak for a long moment. "I heard you," she said finally. "3 days ago, in the alley behind the blue sage, I heard you talking to Crane." Something moved through his face. Not guilt, not quite, but a recognition of the moment he had been dreading and the understanding that the reckoning had arrived. "What did you hear?" he said. "You told him I was a potential problem," she said. "You told him you needed more time to assess what I knew." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you hear the whole conversation?" "I heard enough," she said. "You heard the beginning," he said, and his voice was steady and very careful. "You heard me tell him what he needed to hear to keep him believing that I was one of the people in his orbit. He approached me 4 days ago. He found out I had been asking questions about the mine and decided it was better to bring me into his confidence than to move against me directly. I had 2 choices: walk away and lose everything I have spent 3 years building toward, or play his game long enough to get what I need from inside it. I told him you were a potential problem because from his perspective, you are. A grieving widow who has been quietly building a case for 18 months is absolutely a problem for a man like Dolph Crane." Susanna felt the cold grip on her chest loosen slightly, and she hated that it did, because loosening felt like vulnerability. "How do I know that is true?" she said. "You do not," he said, with the same infuriating honesty he had deployed the first time she had asked him about trust. "Not with certainty. I could be telling you exactly what you need to hear. I am aware of that. But I would ask you to think about what purpose it serves for me to have this conversation at all. If I am working against you, the simplest thing I can do is stay away and let Crane handle whatever he decides to do about you. I am not staying away. I am standing at your creek at sunrise telling you that I have been in 100 places and I have never once stayed for any of them. And this town, this particular piece of ground, this particular morning, is the only one that has ever made the leaving feel like the wrong choice." She looked at him. The light was coming up over the ridge behind her, and it was touching his face and making him look very real and very tired and very much like someone who was telling the absolute truth because he had reached the end of his capacity to do anything else. "The documents you gave me," she said, "are they enough?" "Not yet," he said. "I need one more thing. Crane is meeting with Reeves and 2 other men in 10 days. A meeting to consolidate the remaining claims in the county, including a parcel that legitimately belongs to the estate of Thomas Bristol. If I can document that meeting, have a record of what is discussed, combined with what I already have and your testimony about Thomas, it is enough. It is more than enough." "What do you need from me for that meeting?" she said. "I need you to be somewhere safe," he said, "and I need you to trust me for 10 more days." She stood with the bucket and the dripping water and the mud and the morning light, and she made the decision the way she had made most of the important decisions in the past 18 months, alone and quickly, and with the full weight of the consequences in view. 10 days, she said. "And then I want to know everything, all of it, every piece you have been holding back." "Yes," he said. "And Lionel," she said, using his given name for the first time, and she felt the difference of it, the small, intimate shift of it, and she saw it register on his face. "Yes," he said. "I have not decided what I think about what you just said," she said. "About wanting to stay, I am still deciding." "I know," he said. "I am not in a hurry." She turned and walked back toward the house with the bucket, and she let herself feel, For the first time since Thomas died, the tentative and terrifying warmth of something that might be the beginning of something. The 10 days were not easy days. Susanna went about her routines at the homestead with a surface of normalcy and an interior that was working constantly, processing information, preparing her testimony in her head, measuring it against the documents, checking the logic of it from every angle. She also found herself, against her best intentions, thinking about Lionel Lockhart in ways that had nothing to do with the legal and strategic situation they were navigating together. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the creek mud. She thought about the sentence itself, the particular architecture of it. I have stopped at 100 towns and only one made me want to stay. She thought about what it cost a man like him, a man who had been alone and moving for most of his adult life, to say something like that out loud to another person. She thought about the fact that he had said it without any certainty of how it would be received, which was either very brave or very foolish, and she was finding it increasingly difficult to think of it as foolish. She spoke to Margaret about it, more than she had intended to. Margaret, who had been watching this develop with the sharp eyes of someone who loved Susanna and had been worried about her for a long time, listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when Susanna finished she said, "Do you think he is telling the truth, about all of it?" "Yes," Susanna said. And then, because that had come out with more conviction than she had planned, she added, "I think so. The evidence supports it." "Evidence," Margaret said with a small smile. "Susanna, forget the evidence for a moment. How do you feel when you are with him?" Susanna was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the cottonwoods were losing their leaves in the autumn wind, and the afternoon light was the color of old gold. And she thought about how she had felt in those evening meetings by the creek road, talking through documents and testimony and legal strategy, and how at some point during those conversations the documents had become secondary, and the conversation had become primary, and she had found herself laughing at something he said, actually laughing. For the first time in so long that the sound of it had startled her. "Safe," she said finally. "I feel safe." Which is strange because by any rational measure he is the least safe element of my current situation. "That is not strange at all," Margaret said. "That is what it feels like when it is real." On the 8th day, something happened that changed the timeline. Clem came in from the north fence at midday with a troubled expression and told Susanna that he had seen 2 men on horseback watching the homestead from the ridge. They had been there for about an hour and had ridden off when they saw him looking. Clem had not recognized them, but he described them. One in a dark coat with a bay horse, one in a canvas duster with a roan. Neither of them was anyone from Redgrass. Susanna sent a message to Lionel through the method they had established, a folded note left in the split of a particular cottonwood tree on the creek road. She told him about the men. She told him to be careful. He appeared at her door that evening, which was a risk in itself, but the note had clearly communicated enough urgency to override their usual precautions. He stood in the lamplight of her kitchen doorway, and she looked at him and felt, despite everything, the warm and inconvenient awareness of how much space he had begun to occupy in her internal world without being asked. "Crane is moving faster than I expected," he said. "He does not want to wait for the meeting. He is already worried about you." "What does that mean for us?" she said. He looked at her carefully. "It means I think we should not wait for the meeting. I think we need to go now. Leave Redgrass, go to the territorial capital, present what we have directly to a judge who is outside of Crane's influence. I have a name. A federal judge who came into New Mexico last year specifically to address land fraud. His name is Judge Elias Prentice, and he is based in Albuquerque, and he is not in anyone's pocket." "You said you needed the meeting to complete your case," she said. "I said the meeting would make it enough. What we have right now is substantial. It is not perfect. But 2 men watching your homestead means that waiting for perfect is a worse risk than moving with substantial." She thought about this. She thought about 18 months of careful, patient work. She thought about perfect versus substantial. She thought about the men on the ridge. "When," she said, "Tomorrow morning," he said, "before first light." She looked at him across her kitchen table and she thought about her house, Thomas's house, the 40 acres and the garden and the cattle, and the 18 months of her life that had been lived inside the narrow walls of grief and purpose. And she thought about what it would mean to leave it, even temporarily, even for the right reasons. "What about Clem?" she said. "Take him with you," Lionel said. "He can ride, can he not?" "He can ride," she said. "Then we go together, the three of us. I know the back trails south of town. We can reach Albuquerque in 5 days without using the main road." She nodded. Then she looked at him and said, "You did not have to come and tell me this yourself. You could have sent a note." "I could have," he said. "Why did you come yourself?" He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes, and then he said, "Because I wanted to see your face when I told you. Because I wanted to make sure you knew it was me asking you to trust me with this, not a piece of paper." She felt her heart do something complicated and significant. She said, very quietly, "All right, before first light." The morning they rode out of Redgrass was cold, the kind of cold that sits on the desert land in October and makes the air sharp as metal. The stars were still visible when they left, Susanna and Clem and Lionel, 3 horses moving quietly down the South Creek Road, and then cutting off it onto a trail that Lionel knew from his years of moving through this country. A faint track between the mesquite and the dry arroyos that would take them around the main road and the town, and out into the open land heading south. Susanna looked back once at the dark outline of her house against the pre-dawn sky, the shape of the roof Thomas had built, the window she had left the lamp burning in so that anyone watching would think she was still there. She looked back and felt the ache of it, and then turned forward and rode. The 5 days to Albuquerque were among the most intense and unexpectedly tender days of Susanna's adult life. They were not easy. The trail was hard in places. Water was scarce in the stretches between the creek systems, and on the second day they spotted a rider at a distance that might have been nothing and might have been one of Crane's men, and they made camp that night without a fire and slept in shifts with the horses tied close. Clem, who was 53 and had bad knees and had been drafted into this adventure without much preparation, grumbled with the cheerful stoicism of a man who has made peace with the fact that his life has always contained more difficulty than he deserved. But in the evenings, when the camp was made and Clem had fallen into the deep, immediate sleep of the physically tired, Susanna and Lionel sat beside each other in the desert quiet and talked. They talked about things that had nothing to do with Crane or documents or testimony. They talked about their lives before all of this, the specific ordinary textures of their histories. She told him about growing up in Missouri, in a town called Cartersville, the third of 4 children, her father a school teacher, her mother a woman of tremendous practical intelligence who had taught Susanna to read the character of people and situations with the same systematic rigor that other women were taught to embroider. She told him about meeting Thomas at the age of 21, Thomas who had been earnest and kind and full of plans for the West, for land and possibility and a life built from the ground up. "Did you love him?" Lionel asked, with a straightforwardness that might have been inappropriate from anyone else but from him felt like simple respect. "Yes," she said. "Not with fire, with steadiness. He was a steady man and I loved him steadily, and I miss him in the same way quietly every day like a note that keeps playing underneath everything else." Lionel was quiet for a moment. "I have never had that," he said. "The steadiness. Everything in my life has been motion. I have never been in one place long enough to know what the quiet would feel like." "What does Redgrass feel like?" she said. He looked at her in the way he had been looking at her more often now, openly, with less of the careful management he had shown in those first weeks, and he said, "It feels like what I imagine steadiness feels like. In parts, specifically." And she understood that the specifically meant her. On the third evening she was cold, and she had not brought a sufficient blanket, and he offered her his coat without making it into anything except a practical offer, and she accepted it. And for a while they sat with the coat across both of them because it was not quite large enough for two people otherwise. And she was aware of his warmth beside her and the particular reality of his presence, the physical fact of him, in a way that made her feel both very grounded and very aware. He did not do anything about it. He sat beside her in the dark, and they talked about Judge Elia's Prentice and the best way to present the evidence and what they could expect from the proceeding. And the whole conversation was entirely sensible and entirely beside the point, because underneath it something was being said that had no words yet, but that both of them were hearing clearly. On the fourth day they crossed into the Rio Grande Valley, and the character of the land changed, became more green, more inhabited, the river running broad and brown through its corridor of cottonwoods, and Clem said, "Well, that is better on the eyes," and urged his horse into a trot. They arrived in Albuquerque on the fifth day in the afternoon. The town was considerably larger than Redgrass, a proper territorial city with adobe buildings and a rail depot, and the busy, layered noise of a place where different worlds were continually colliding and negotiating. Lionel knew where to find rooms: a clean and legitimate boarding house near the federal courthouse, run by a woman who asked no questions and provided good food, and he also knew where to find Judge Prentice. Judge Elia's Prentice received them the following morning. He was a man in his middle 50s, lean and sharp-featured, with the particular economy of movement and attention that develops in men who have spent decades making consequential decisions. He listened to everything Lionel and Susanna presented without interrupting, reading the documents as they were laid before him, occasionally asking a brief, precise question, and when they were finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment and then looked at them and said, "This is the most complete presentation of land fraud across the territory that I have seen on this bench. The gap in it is that you do not have the meeting." "We do not have the meeting," Lionel agreed. "But we have 18 months of documented patterns, a suppressed assay report, correspondence demonstrating coordination between the principals, and a direct witness to the circumstances of Thomas Bristol's death and the subsequent coerced sale of his share." "It is enough for an indictment," the judge said. "Possibly enough for a conviction if the defendants do not have exceptionally competent representation." He looked at Susanna. "Mrs. Bristol, are you prepared to testify publicly?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "And are you aware that doing so may create personal risk to your safety?" "Judge Prentice," she said, "I have been aware of personal risk to my safety for 18 months. I am not stopping now." The judge's expression shifted fractionally towards something that might have been admiration. He picked up the first document in the pile and began to make notes. The proceedings in Albuquerque took 3 weeks. There was an indictment, followed by the arrest of Dolph Crane, which was effected by federal marshals and which Susanna did not witness but was told about in detail by a visibly satisfied Lionel, who had stood outside the federal building that morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like a man who has been carrying a stone for a very long time and has just been permitted to set it down. Harlan Reeves, when informed that his business partner had been arrested and that federal investigators were examining the full history of the Cassidy mine, made a series of decisions in rapid succession. He hired a lawyer, attempted to negotiate a reduced exposure by providing testimony against Crane, and in doing so provided the federal case with exactly the meeting testimony that Lionel had originally been waiting to obtain. The case against Crane became, in the space of a week, not merely substantial but overwhelming. During those 3 weeks in Albuquerque, Susanna and Lionel were together most days. They sat in the federal courthouse together during the procedural hearings. They prepared her testimony together in the evenings in the sitting room of the boarding house, Clem occupying the chair by the window and contributing occasional dry observations, and then falling asleep. They walked along the Rio Grande in the mornings before the courthouse sessions, in the early autumn chill, talking through the day ahead, and sometimes not talking at all, just walking side by side along the river in a companionable quiet that felt, to Susanna, like something she had not had in so long that she had almost forgotten the texture of it. On the evening after Crane's arrest, she found Lionel on the boarding house porch, looking out at the street, and she went and stood beside him, and he turned and looked at her, and she saw something in his face that was very close to peace, which was not a quality she had associated with him before, and she thought, somewhat helplessly, that it suited him enormously. "Is this what you expected it to feel like?" she said. "When you finally got here?" "No," he said. "I expected it to feel like finishing. Like reaching the end of something, but it does not feel like that." "What does it feel like?" she said. He looked at her and said, "It feels like the beginning." She felt the warmth move through her. That warmth she had been rationing and managing and trying to keep in its proper category for weeks now. And she thought about all the times she had told herself. She was a practical woman, and practical women did not feel this way about drifters with dark pasts and no fixed address. And she thought about the creek in the morning light, and the things he had said there. And she thought about Clem asleep in his chair, and the 5 days of desert riding and the coat they had shared in the cold, and the way he had said her name, Susanna, not Mrs. Bristol, not ma'am, but Susanna, with the particular weight of someone using a name because it belongs to a specific person they have been thinking about. She said, "I have decided." "Decided what?" he said. "About what you told me at the creek," she said. "About wanting to stay." He turned to face her fully, and the lamplight from the boarding house window was behind her, and she thought he looked like a man who was very carefully not saying anything in case the wrong word broke the moment. "And," he said. "I would like it," she said quietly, "if you stayed." He was quiet for a long moment. And then, with a care and a precision that she had come to understand was not hesitation but respect, he took her hand, just that. He took her hand and held it in both of his, and the warmth of his grip was steady and certain, and everything she had asked for without knowing she was asking. "I intended to whether you wanted me to or not," he said. "But I am very glad you want me to." She laughed. She actually laughed, the real laugh that she had discovered again during those evenings on the desert trail, and he smiled at her, that rare and unguarded smile, and somewhere behind them Clem opened the boarding house door and said, "Are you two going to stand out there all night? Because it is cold and supper is on the table," and they went inside. Susanna gave her formal testimony before Judge Prentice 6 days later. She was on the stand for 2.5 hours. She told the full history, Thomas and the mine, the suppressed assay, the coerced sale, the night she had gone into the tunnel with a lantern and found the sawn timbers, every meeting with Sheriff Pratt, every letter to the county seat and the territorial capital, every door that had been closed in her face. She spoke clearly and without emotion, in the precise and organized way of someone who has been preparing this account for a long time, and the courtroom was very quiet while she spoke. When she stepped down from the stand and walked to the seat beside Lionel, he reached over very briefly and pressed her hand, and she pressed back. Dolph Crane was convicted of land fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and the unlawful taking of mineral rights. The conviction carried a sentence of 25 years. Harlan Reeves, in exchange for his testimony, received a lesser sentence and was required to return Susanna's share of the Cassidy mine at its current fair market value, which was, now that the suppressed assay was part of the public record, considerably more than he had originally paid for it. Sheriff Calvin Pratt was removed from office and faced separate proceedings for his role in the fraudulent accident report. Susanna stood outside the federal courthouse on the day of the conviction in the pale October sunshine and felt the weight of 18 months lift off her, not all at once, but in the way weight actually lifts, piece by piece, the body adjusting incrementally to the new condition of lightness. Lionel stood beside her. Clem stood on her other side and blew his nose loudly into a handkerchief and said it was the dust, and nobody contradicted him. They rode back to Redgrass 2 weeks later. The journey north was different from the journey south. They took the main road. They moved slowly, not because of caution, but because none of them was in a particular hurry. The weather was turning cold properly now, the cottonwoods almost bare, the sky that deep high blue of New Mexico in late autumn. They camped at night beside the fires they made and Clem cooked, whatever he had managed to acquire in the way of supplies, and told long, complicated stories about the years before the war with the satisfaction of a man who has been given an extended audience. On the last evening before they reached Redgrass, Susanna and Lionel sat together after Clem had turned in and the fire was burning low, and she said, "What happens now, for you?" He looked at the fire. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said carefully, "you came to Redgrass for a purpose that is now concluded. The reason you stopped is gone. What keeps a drifter in one place when the thing that brought him there is finished?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are asking me something, not just wondering aloud." "I am asking you," she said, "what your intentions are." "I am a widow with a homestead and 40 acres, and a history in this community. And I am not in the habit of imprecision when it comes to things that matter to me." He turned and looked at her, and she saw in his face, in the firelight, the full weight of what he felt for her, not managed or restrained, but there, plain as the dark sky above them and the cold air around them and the particular quiet of the New Mexico desert at night. "My intentions," he said, "are to ask you if you would permit me to court you properly. To ride into Redgrass with you tomorrow and stay there, to let people know that I am staying, to find work on the land or in the town or wherever work is needed, and to be, for as long as you will have me, a permanent and specific fixture in your life rather than a passing one. That is my intention." "That is very specific for a drifter," she said. "I told you at the creek," he said. "I am not a drifter anymore. I have been a drifter for 23 years and I am done with it. I am choosing to be done with it." She looked at him across the fire. She thought about all the ways this could go wrong. She thought about the practical complications, the town's perceptions, the adjustments required, the learning of each other that was still ahead, all the ordinary difficult business of building a life alongside another person. She thought about all of that with her full, clear, rational mind. And then she said, "I would like that very much." He smiled. She reached across the space between them and he took her hand again, and they sat by the dying fire until the cold drove them into their respective bedrolls. And Clem's snoring filled the night air with a sound that was, somehow, entirely the right soundtrack for the moment. They rode into Redgrass on a Thursday morning in early November, and the town received them in the way small towns receive returned residents, with observation and commentary, and the immediate beginning of a narrative that would be refined and elaborated over the coming weeks until it became the official version of events. Margaret Alcott was at the edge of town when they rode in, which was not coincidence, because Margaret had a reliable sense of when Susanna was coming and going, and she looked at Susanna and then at Lionel and then at Susanna again with an expression that communicated everything necessary without requiring words. "Welcome back," she said. "Thank you, Margaret," Susanna said. Margaret looked at Lionel. "You are staying, I take it." "With your permission and the town's tolerance," he said. "I will speak to the town," Margaret said, and given that Margaret Alcott was one of the most respected women in Redgrass and had been for 15 years, this was a more substantial offer than it appeared. The days that followed were a recalibration. Susanna returned to her homestead and found it exactly as she had left it, Clem having arranged for a neighbor to keep an eye on the cattle while they were gone. She walked through the rooms and the quiet of the place, and felt it differently now, not as a tomb she was maintaining out of obligation to the dead, but as a home she was returning to with the full intention of living in it. She sat at the kitchen table that first evening and looked at the spot where Thomas's papers had been spread out for a year and a half, and she felt the grief and the love for Thomas clearly and cleanly, without the bitterness that the unsettled injustice of his death had wound through it for so long. The justice had been done. Thomas could rest now, and so could she. Lionel took a job with the livery stable for the first 2 weeks, because Amos Price had more work than he could manage, and Lionel had a way with horses that Amos found immediately valuable. He found a room at Clara Deeds's boarding house again, because the proprieties of 1883 required separate addresses, and both he and Susanna had a quiet, shared understanding that they were going to do this properly and in the right order. He came to the homestead on Saturday evenings for supper. This was understood to be a courting arrangement, announced to no one explicitly, but understood by everyone in the way that things in small towns are understood before they are announced. Margaret brought a cake the first Saturday, which Susanna found both touching and extremely unnecessary and did not say so. Clem pointedly found extra work in the barn during the evening hours and made himself scarce with a subtlety that was about as subtle as a thunderstorm. The Saturday evening suppers were where the real work of knowing each other happened, the long, layered, specific knowing that builds a foundation rather than a feeling. They talked about everything. They talked about the mine's settlement and what she planned to do with it. They talked about the 40 acres and whether the northern section could be made productive for grain or whether it would always be better for grazing. They talked about his years as a deputy marshal and the specific details of the cases he had worked. They talked about books, because she had a shelf of them and he was a thorough and serious reader, and they had opinions about the same things with enough difference to make the conversation interesting. They talked about the future in the tentative, careful way of two people who can see the shape of something ahead and are approaching it without rushing, because rushing is for people who do not believe the thing will actually arrive. And in between all the talking, the other thing happened, the building of the physical awareness of each other, the increasing difficulty of maintaining an appropriate distance, the evenings that ended later and later with both of them sitting closer together on the porch in the November cold than was strictly necessary for the stated purpose of conversation. He kissed her for the first time on the 14th Saturday. She had been speaking about the garden, of all things, the plan she had for expanding it in the spring, and he had been listening with the expression of a man who is genuinely interested in what she is saying and also increasingly aware that the distance between them on the porch steps has been gradually decreasing without either of them having made a conscious decision about it. And she looked up from the garden planning to find him very close, and his eyes on her face with the same unguarded directness he had looked at her with on the 5th night of the desert crossing. She kissed him first actually, which seemed appropriate because she had always been the one to say directly what needed saying, and what needed to be said right now was best said without words. It was not a brief, ceremonial kiss. It was a full and honest one with all the weight of everything that had passed between them in it, and when they separated she looked at him and he looked at her and they were both very quiet for a moment. "I have been waiting," he said. "I know," she said. "I was not ready before now." "I know," he said. "I am ready now," she said. "I know," he said, with that rare smile, and she laughed, and they sat together on the porch steps in the November cold until the stars moved significantly across the sky, and Susanna finally said it was late, and Lionel rode back to town with the particular quality of movement of a man who is carrying something precious. He proposed in February, which in the New Mexico territory of 1883 was still cold enough for a fire in the evening, and they were in her kitchen with a fire going, and Clem had manufactured some errand in town that would keep him occupied until morning, and Lionel had brought a bottle of rye whiskey and 2 glasses, and they had been sitting at the kitchen table talking for 3 hours when he stopped mid-sentence about a grazing rights issue on the north section and said, "Susanna, will you marry me?" She put down her glass. She looked at him. She thought, with a rush of clarity that was entirely different from the cold, careful clarity she had been applying to things for the past 2 years, that this man had ridden into her town with a bullet hole in his coat and a hidden past and a specific dangerous purpose, and had turned out, against every reasonable expectation, to be the steadiest thing she had encountered since Thomas, only with the addition of a fire that Thomas, in his wonderful earnest steadiness, had never quite ignited in her. "Yes," she said, Obviously, yes, he exhaled. She realized with great warmth that he had been nervous. She leaned across the kitchen table and kissed him, and he held her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her close her eyes. They were married in April of 1884, in the church at the north end of Redgrass, on a clear morning with the red bluffs bright against a sky the color of blue glass. Margaret was her attendant. Clem walked her down the aisle because there was no one else, and because he had been her family for 2 years and it was right. The new county sheriff, a man named Robert Alcindor, who had been appointed after Calvin Pratt's removal, and who was considerably more interested in actual law enforcement than his predecessor had been, attended with his wife. The church was full. Redgrass, for all its smallness, had come to understand what Susanna and Lionel had built and fought through together, and it turned out for them in the way that communities turn out for things that are worth turning out for. Lionel stood at the front of the church in a clean dark suit that he had acquired in Albuquerque and had been maintaining with tremendous care. And when she came down the aisle, he looked at her with everything he felt completely visible on his face, not managed, not restrained, just there. And she thought, this is what it looks like when someone who has been moving for 23 years finally understands that they have arrived. They said their vows with a simplicity that suited both of them. They were not people who needed elaborate performances. They needed the promise to be real and the intention to be full, and both of those things were present in the plain and certain words they said to each other in that small church in April. They rode back to the homestead together that afternoon, and it was their homestead now, both of theirs, and the 40 acres spread out around them in the spring light, with the garden showing the first green of the season, and the cattle moving slowly in the north field and the creek running clear and cold at the property's east edge. "This is the place," Lionel said, looking out at it. "Yes," she said. "The one I wanted to stay for," he said. She took his hand. They went inside. The first year of their marriage was the year of building, not the dramatic building of before, not the building against something external and threatening, but the ordinary, necessary, profoundly satisfying building of a shared life. Lionel left the livery and began working the homestead full-time alongside Clem, and it turned out that he knew considerably more about cattle and land management than his years of drifting had suggested, having picked up working knowledge in a dozen different places that he now applied to one place with the concentrated attention of someone who finally had a reason to make something last. They expanded the north herd. They improved the house, adding a second room and a proper covered porch with a railing. Lionel built a proper smokehouse from adobe brick, and Clem supervised its construction with the professional authority of a man who has never built a smokehouse in his life, but has strong opinions about how it should be done. The garden expanded to the full extent of what the soil and water could support, and Susanna sold the excess at the Redgrass market through the summer months. They had disagreements, because they were both people of strong convictions, and neither of them was inclined to defer when they thought they were right. They disagreed about the best method for rotating the cattle between pastures, a disagreement that lasted 3 days and was ultimately resolved when they tried both methods, and Susanna's proved slightly more effective, and Lionel acknowledged this with minimal gracefulness. They disagreed about whether to take a particular offer from a land speculator who approached them about the northeast corner of the 40 acres, and on this one Lionel was right and Susanna acknowledged it promptly, which she found somehow more annoying than acknowledging it slowly. They argued once about something so small that neither of them could afterward remember what it had been, only that it had been heated, and that it had ended with Lionel walking out to the barn, and Susanna sitting at the kitchen table with her arms crossed, and then, 20 minutes later, both of them arriving at the porch at the same moment from different directions, and looking at each other and laughing, and that being the end of it. The settlement from the Reeves payment came through in June of 1884, and it was enough to clear the remaining debt on the homestead and have a significant sum remaining. They sat at the kitchen table together, the two of them and Clem, and talked about what to do with it. Clem suggested buying more land to the south. Lionel wanted to put most of it into improving the water situation on the north section, which was chronically dry in summer, and limiting the herd. Susanna listened to both ideas and then said she wanted to do both, and also to set aside a portion for Clem's future, which made Clem stand up and claim he needed to see to something in the barn and come back 20 minutes later red-faced and gruff and enormously grateful. In the winter of 1884, Susanna realized she was expecting a child. She told Lionel on a cold evening in December, when the first snow of the season had come down from the mountains and settled thin and white over the valley, and she told him at the kitchen table by lamplight, directly, because it was her way to say things directly, and she watched his face change as she spoke. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. And then he stood up and came around the table and held her with a strength and a tenderness that she felt in every part of her, and he said nothing for a long time, just held her, and she understood that he was feeling something too large for immediate words. "A father," he said finally, into her hair. "In approximately 7 months," she said. "Yes." He pulled back to look at her face. His eyes were bright, which she had never seen before, not quite like this. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling entirely well," she said. "Stop looking at me like I might break. I am not a breakable woman." "I know," he said with a smile. "I know exactly what kind of woman you are. That is why I am looking at you like this. Because you are extraordinary and you are going to have my child, and I am trying to understand how my life became so much more than I ever expected it would be." She put her hand on his face. "You chose it," she said. "You stopped at the right town." He covered her hand with his. "The only town," he said. Their son was born in July of 1885, on a hot and cloudless New Mexico morning, attended by Dr. Fenwick and Margaret Alcott, who had delivered enough babies in her time to be a more reliable presence than the doctor on his best days. He was a healthy and vocal boy who arrived with an opinion about his circumstances and the lung power to express it clearly, and who looked, in Susanna's estimation, exactly like his father except for the gray eyes, which were entirely hers. They named him Thomas Lionel Bristol Lockhart, and the Bristol came first because it was important to Susanna that her son carry his father's name, and the Lockhart followed it because Lionel was alive and here, and had built this child's home with his own hands. Clem held the baby on the porch the evening after the birth, with the careful, amazed expression of a man who has not held a baby in several decades, and is discovering that the instinct returns intact, and said, "Well, looks like I am staying on then." And nobody had ever been in any doubt about that, but they were all glad he said it. Young Thomas proved to be an energetic and curious child, who learned to walk early and immediately applied his mobility to an ambitious program of investigation that required constant supervision. He had Susanna's systematic quality and Lionel's physical capability and Clem's inexhaustible capacity for being somewhere he was not expected, and the homestead adjusted itself around him, as homesteads adjust around children, with the installation of gates and the acquisition of a small sturdy pony when he was 3 years old, and the discovery that the garden could not be left unattended for any period of time during which Thomas Lionel Bristol Lockhart was both awake and free. Lionel was a father with the same quality of presence he brought to everything, fully there, fully attentive, with the specific tenderness of a man who had spent most of his life without a family of his own, and was now handling one with both hands and enormous care. He taught his son to ride before the boy could fully articulate the request to learn. He told him stories in the evenings, sitting on the porch in the summer dark, stories drawn from the places he had been and the things he had seen, and Susanna sometimes sat inside the open window and listened to his voice and his son's voice and the particular music of those two people talking, and felt a fullness that she had no adequate word for. The Cassidy mine, now operating legitimately under a new management arrangement that reflected the actual value of its output, continued to produce well through the middle years of the decade. The share that had been restored to Susanna's estate provided a reliable income that, combined with the homestead's productivity, made the Bristol Lockhart household one of the more comfortable in the Redgrass area. They used this comfort purposefully. They expanded the north section as Lionel had planned, improving the water with a proper well and a windmill. They added a second horse shed and a proper root cellar. Susanna established a lending library in the Redgrass schoolhouse, donating her own books and organizing a subscription among the town's families. And within 2 years, it had enough volumes to be genuinely useful to both the schoolchildren and the adults who frequented it. Lionel, who had spent years carrying his knowledge of territorial land fraud and having no legitimate outlet for it, was approached by Judge Prentice in 1886 to provide consulting testimony in 2 additional land fraud cases in the territory. He did this from Redgrass, making the journey to Albuquerque when required and returning promptly, and he wrote detailed account letters to the judge's office between appearances that became, over time, a reference document that the territorial court used in training new marshals. He was offered a formal appointment twice. Both times he declined, though not without some consideration the second time. He told Susanna about the second offer over supper one evening, and she listened carefully and then said, "What do you want?" And he said, "I want to be here. I want this." And she said, "Then that is your answer," and they did not discuss it further. In the autumn of 1887, Susanna discovered she was expecting again. She told Lionel at the creek, which felt right, which felt like the place where the telling of important things had always happened between them. He took her hand in the early morning light, the same bank where he had stood 2 years before the marriage, and confessed that he had stopped at 100 towns and wanted to stay at only this one. And he said, "Another one," with a kind of wondering gratitude that made her love him with a fierceness that still, after 3 years of marriage, surprised her with its intensity. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1888 on a morning so clear and golden that the light itself seemed celebratory. They named her Eleanora Jane Bristol Lockhart, and she arrived in the world with an expression of profound assessment, as though she had already decided that she was going to be watching things carefully for the rest of her life, which Susanna recognized as a quality she herself had possessed from birth. Thomas Lionel, who was 2.5 years old and had been informed that a sibling was coming and had received this information with the equanimity of someone who has never had to share his parents and has strong feelings about beginning to do so, looked at his sister for a long time on the morning after her birth, and then said, in a tone of thoughtful resignation, "She is very small." And Susanna said, "She is." And Thomas said, "I will look after her." And that was the beginning of a relationship between those two that would, in the years ahead, be one of the central structures of the household. Margaret Alcott attended the birth of Eleanora as she had attended the birth of Thomas, and she held the baby afterward with an expression that Susanna had come to understand meant that Margaret was feeling things she would not say, and Susanna reached over and took her hand, and Margaret pressed it and nodded once, and that was enough. The years settled into the shape of a good life. The homestead grew and thrived. Redgrass grew slowly, as small territorial towns did in the 1880s, acquiring a second mercantile and eventually a proper hotel and a doctor who stayed longer than Dr. Fenwick, who retired to Santa Fe in 1889. The rail spur was extended and improved. The school was expanded. Susanna was on the school board from 1887 onward and was its most effective member, in the opinion of everyone who served with her and the school's teachers. Clem Hooper turned 60 in 1890, and the homestead threw him a proper celebration that included the attendance of most of Redgrass and a quantity of food that required 2 days of preparation. He was slower on his feet than he had been when Susanna first hired him, But he was still at the fence lines every morning and still had opinions about the cattle that were usually correct and always forcefully delivered. He had a room in the main house now, which had expanded to accommodate all of them, and he sat at the family table every evening as a matter of course, because there had never been a serious discussion about any other arrangement. Lionel turned 40 in 1892. Susanna organized a supper for him with Margaret and Clem and the Alcindors, and two other families from town who had become the particular inner circle of their social world. She gave him a book she had sourced through considerable effort from a bookseller in Santa Fe, a detailed history of the New Mexico territory that she knew he would read cover to cover and annotate in the margins and argue with periodically. He held it for a long time after she gave it to him, and then looked at her with the full weight of everything he felt for her and said, "You always know exactly the right thing." And she said, "I know you." And he said, "Yes, you do." And the table full of people diplomatically found a great deal to discuss among themselves for a few minutes. On a morning in the spring of 1893, which was a decade after Lionel Lockhart had first ridden into Redgrass from the south on a trailing bay horse, Susanna went down to Coldwater Creek to fill the bucket in the way she had gone down countless times before. The morning was warm and clear, the first full warmth of the season, and the creek was running high with snowmelt from the mountains to the north, and the cottonwoods were green and full, and the birds were loud in them. She was not alone at the creek. She had not been alone at the creek in the mornings for several years, because Lionel habitually came down with her, carrying his own bucket when there was hauling to be done or simply walking with her when there was not. It had become the morning ritual that marked their days, the walk to the creek and back, the quiet that they occupied together with the ease of people who have learned each other entirely, and find the knowledge a comfort rather than a constraint. He was walking beside her and she looked at him in the morning light, this man who had ridden in from the south with a bullet hole in his coat and a hidden purpose, and had been a stranger, and then an ally and then a love and then a husband and now, most fundamentally and lastingly, himself, Lionel, the specific irreplaceable person she had built a decade of days with. "What are you thinking about?" he said, because he had noticed her looking. "I was thinking about the first morning you were here at the creek," she said, "when you told me you had stopped at 100 towns and only one made you want to stay." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when something moved him. "I was terrified," he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell." "I had never said anything like that to anyone before," he said. "I had never felt anything like that before. I did not know if it was the right thing to say or whether you would simply turn around and walk back to the house." "I considered it," she said honestly. He laughed. "I know. I am glad I did not," she said. He stopped walking and she stopped beside him, and the creek ran beside them, and the morning light was the same pale gold it had been on that first morning, and the cottonwoods moved in a small breeze, and everything was exactly as it should be and exactly where it needed to be. He took her face in his hands, the gesture he had first made at the kitchen table on the evening he proposed, and that had become, in the decade since, the gesture she associated most completely with him, with being seen by him and known and held. "Susanna," he said. "Yes," she said. "There is nowhere I would rather be," he said. "There is nothing I would rather have than this. I want you to know that. Not just this morning, every morning." She put her hands over his. She looked at him in the creek morning light, and she felt the full weight of their life together, the injustice that had preceded it, and the courage that had built it, and the ordinary, extraordinary dailiness of it. The supper table and the children's voices and the fence lines and the books and the arguments and the laughter and the long quiet evenings on the porch, with the desert spreading out in all directions, and the stars coming up one by one, and the man beside her who had been moving all his life and had stopped here, at this creek, in this valley for her. "I know," she said. "And I want you to know that you were worth trusting." He smiled at her. It was the full smile, the rare and unguarded one, the one she had been collecting for 10 years. "Come on," she said. The children will be awake." They filled the buckets and walked back up the creek path to the homestead together. Their steps matched, the morning opening around them bright and warm and full of the ordinary blessings of a life that had been fought for, and won, and built piece by careful piece from the rubble of loss, and the unlikely grace of a drifter who had finally found the one place in 100 towns that was worth stopping for. Young Thomas was already up when they came in, sitting at the kitchen table with the deliberate application of a 7-year-old, trying to read a page of Susanna's lending library book that was too old for him, determined to manage it anyway. Eleonora came down the stairs a moment later, 5 years old and already possessed of the gray eyes and the watchful quality that ran in her mother's line, and she climbed onto her father's lap before he had fully set his bucket down and said, "Good morning," with the gravity of someone for whom the greeting was a formal occasion. Lionel held her and looked at Susanna over her head with an expression she knew as well as her own name. She set the kettle on the stove. Clem came in from the barn, stamping his boots at the door. The morning light came through the windows and lay across the floor in long rectangles of gold. Outside, the cattle moved in the field, and the windmill turned slowly in the early breeze, and the creek ran cold and clear at the edge of the land they had made into something worth staying for. This was the life, not the one either of them had planned or predicted or in some cases believed they deserved, but the one they had arrived at together, through the dark and the uncertainty and the forced choices, and the moments at the creek where everything was terribly uncertain, and the only thing available was the truth and the willingness to say it. The loyal drifter had stopped at one town. He had stayed in that town for every reason that mattered. And the woman who had been alone inside her grief and her purpose and her careful, measured survival had opened her hands and let something new in. They had built the rest from there, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, by every measure that mattered, exactly everything.